funny you say, cash is dirty right now. Cash has been dirty for a long, long time.
Exactly.
So it's nasty. But I think COVID clearly has brought that nastiness to our attention more acutely, and is kind of generally encouraging everybody to realize that, okay, how do we just reduce the risk of spreading this thing? If one way we can do so
Right.
is to just reduce our contact with money, with paper money that's traveled through we don't know how many markets, how many hands, well, let's do that.
Yet another week, another episode. Hello and welcome to the AOU podcast, Entrepreneur Leadership in Africa, where we explore more on being a bold entrepreneur leader. I'm your host, Savannah Olo, and today I have with me Ramatoulaye Diallo. Ramatoulaye, or Rama for short, is an award-winning leader with 22 plus years of experience building up people and teams as an entrepreneur, and an investor. She's also the CEO of Orange Finances Mobiles Senegal, Director of Digital Finances Services, Orange Sonatel Group, Non-Executive Director of CCOM. I believe I got that right. So, today we highlight the future of mobile money, leading change in times of adversity. Take a hint, that's an article that she published on LinkedIn some time back. And some things that are near and dear to her, such as women empowerment and embracing motherhood, or finding places or spaces in which we can include ourselves. So Rama, thank you so much for being with us today. Maybe you can introduce yourself and tell us more about who you are and how you got to learn about EOU.
So to your question, I'm going to start with the second part, which is how I know ALU.
Right.
I've actually known the AL group pretty much from the beginning. I've known Fred for a long time, and when he was starting his various ventures that are all now under the group, we both lived in Johannesburg at the same time, around the same time.
Right.
I was starting Endeavor South Africa. And so I've followed the journey and the mission, and it's something that I very much, first of all, I'm proud of all the work that the group has done over the past years, and I'm also just very much aligned with its vision for Africa, and Fred and team are clearly focused on pushing that forward every day. So for me, it's a pleasure, honestly, to be with you, and ALU being a relatively newer addition to the AL group family. I think has a real sacred mission in terms of educating Africa's leaders and doing it on African soil. So I think that's really exciting. Then in terms of your first question, something that's not on the internet, that I'm a big foodie. I actually, used to have a food blog, which is no longer on the internet.
Oh no.
But I'm a big food fan.
Yeah.
So yeah.
All right. So tell us more about yourself. Maybe something we might have not mentioned in the introduction. Obviously, you're a foodie now, but now we know we can relate to you. you brought us closer to you. So maybe introduce further about yourself. Tell us about what you're about or your experiences in the industries that you've been in.
Well, to kind of summarize what I'm about, I mean, I'm very much, so I was born and raised in Senegal, but my life and career have taken me all around, whether it was to the United States, but also to other African countries and to discovering other African cultures, my brothers and sisters all across the continent, either places I have lived for a long time, like Nigeria and South Africa, or places I have visited for work or for pleasure. So I very much, if there's one thing I think that that is so dear to me, is I very much see myself as obviously very deeply rooted in where I come from, West Africa, in Senegal, and going back to actually the 1800s. Our ancestors came from Guinea. That's a whole other story. But it just further roots me into very much, West Africa as my home. But I see it as a place to grow from, as a tree, sort of reaching for the sky and embracing. If there's an image I would use, and embracing the rest of the continent. So all things that have to do with developing our continent and working on finding real solutions for our continent, those things are dear to my heart. I mean, we'll come back to some of those things, but really using technology and our know-how and our experiences to create solutions that are solutions to actual problems, not just sort of nice to haves or things that we copy from elsewhere. And closely related to that mission as well for me is really fully kind of realizing myself as an African woman, and then using whatever bit of resources I do have to keep the doors open that I had open for me, keep them more open, kick them down if possible, and then open some other doors for those coming behind. So for me, what I call sovereignty for African women is something that's incredibly dear to my heart. And again, we can talk more about it, but it starts with working on oneself and then being able to um, to to really be a part of the conversations, or to sit at the tables where key decisions are being made, capital is being allocated, solutions are being designed that are going to have a real impact on us now, but also on our children, in the years or decades to come.
Right. All right. So, based on your experiences that we've seen, you're very passionate about how digitization is evolving, and coming into management, finance management as well. So, in December 2018, you spoke about the future of cash at the Dakar Digital Show, and also at the Innovation Africa Digital Summit in Addis. So please share with us your opinion about the future of cash and the digital finance on the continent.
Yeah, I mean the interesting thing is, I always say cash is our most relentless competitor, or perhaps cash will view us as the ones who have come to the party now to compete with it, given that it's been around, and it's been around obviously for a very long time because it serves a real purpose, and responds to the needs of the customers. So whatever digital tool finance wants to modernize itself with, will have to compete with cash in terms of just how its ease of use, its availability, its transferability. So what we need to bring on top of that is probably things to do with security, and so when I think about the future of cash, I don't think it's something that is going to completely disappear. And perhaps that's not even the purpose. But the purpose is, how do we further include financially? And obviously that goes through digital inclusion first. There's no question that in our parts of the world, the banks have, depending on the country, have done more or less of a good job, but to really reach scale and to include as many people as possible into the traceable economy. Let's call it that. I don't really like to call it formal versus informal. That's a whole other debate. But let's call it the traceable economy. Clearly, that has the industry that's been able to take the baton from the banks and go furthest. So far, it's been the telcos via mobile money.
Yeah.
But even that, I mean, if you look at mobile money, it's only 12 years old, which in terms of an industry is actually incredibly young. So for me, that's extremely exciting. That means that there are far more pages to write in this history than have been written so far. And we can certainly also, and this is exciting, be a place of leadership and innovation, because when it comes to mobile money, when it comes to financial services in the phone, Africa is definitely the leader. So this is one aspect, one part, one corner of technology or applications of technology where we're the leader, and we actually do have an opportunity to continue to lead and innovate all across the continent. As you know, if you put Orange Money, Momo Cash, and M-Pesa together, I mean, our customers are still, if I'm not mistaken, just maybe in the 100 million or so active customers, maybe a bit more. I don't remember the exact number, but it's definitely not a billion. It's not 500 million. So given the population, given the active population, given how young our population is, and especially how deeply penetrated it is in terms of cell phone ownership and usage, we still have a lot of work to do to bring financial services to them. So, all of that to say that the future of cash is not its disappearance, but there is actually still so much work to do as far as financial services, as far as just inclusion and then innovation, that we're still in the very early days of this story.
It's funny you say that because I think I was around the age of maybe 8 or 9 when M-Pesa was brought about in Nairobi. And the first time it was like, oh, there's money in your phone. You can send money directly to somebody through your phone. And at first it was like people were very skeptical of the safety of it and the security that came with it.
Of course.
But now saying I don't have M-Pesa, it's like, what? Are you serious?
You'll be banished.
Even now, like during even now during the COVID situation, it's like we don't want to touch cash. Cash is very dirty right now. So if you don't have M-Pesa, maybe swipe your card or something. But it's crazy to see how things have evolved and how mindsets have also changed as we go. And definitely the future of cash is digital money. And, essentially it's what the numbers you see on your account on the screen and not necessarily the amount of paper you have in your wallet. Yeah.
Absolutely. And I think, you mentioned COVID. I think it's funny you say, cash is dirty right now. Cash has been dirty for a long, long time.
Exactly.
So it's nasty. But I think COVID clearly has brought that nastiness to our attention more acutely, and is kind of generally encouraging everybody to realize that, okay, how do we just reduce the risk of spreading this thing?
Right.
If one way we can do so is to just reduce our contact with money, with paper money that's traveled through we don't know how many markets, how many hands, well, let's do that. Yeah.
All right, so speaking of recent innovations, we've talked about M-Pesa, maybe e-wallets, contactless payments, and digital financial services. In your opinion, how can young entrepreneurs on the continent leverage this opportunity where we have digital money?
The sky is the limit. I mean, as I said earlier, honestly, we're still at the very early stages of this adventure, and we're still working on being as frictionless as cash.
Right.
So there's still, if you look at just the general ecosystem around what it takes to deliver these services, e-wallets, etc., there's still a lot of work to be done. So I think wherever you look, however you look at it, I see sort of the big players like Orange Money, for example, or M-Pesa, almost as, okay, being at the center, and our role, ideally over the next 10 years, is to build an ecosystem.
Yeah.
Now, we can't do everything, right? So that's where I think the opportunity is for young entrepreneurs, or young entrepreneurs of any age, and especially entrepreneurs of any gender, let me just say, also to come and bring a brick, because they can focus on either an opportunity or a problem and solve it in a way that we perhaps don't have the resources or the time, or frankly maybe the innovative muscle to see the problem or its solution in such a new light. So I think there's definitely great opportunities to build different things, whether it's an application or a service, or around the infrastructure that we are already putting in place. I think also for entrepreneurs, it's usually easier for people to think about what I call sort of the customer facing aspects. So everybody thinks about building an app, or doing something that touches directly the final customer, which is great.
Yeah.
But I think people also need to remember that when it comes to financial services, there's a whole lot that needs to happen on the back end. I actually just today published a short little note about identity.
Okay.
And how identifying the client is really at the core of the requirement for being a financial services provider in general. Like the regulators, this is the most basic thing. Being able to say who's your customer, and how do you verify that he or she is who they say they are. So that's been done traditionally with, you go and fill out a form, you give a copy of your ID.
Yeah.
It used to be literally reams of paper that the bank would keep in its agency, in its branch somewhere.
Yeah.
Then we maybe began to scan it and maybe keep logs somewhere that can be consulted. So clearly there is still a ton that can be done to fully digitize the process of getting to know a customer. Because I actually believe we have the tools. Like, technology does a far better job of that, frankly, than a piece of paper. Now, clearly, there are issues that need to be taken into account when it comes to privacy and access to data, and all of that needs to be on a permission basis. But when you put together the phone data and the movement data and the mobile money transaction data of someone, with their name, their phone number, etc. My point is, you have a lot of information about a customer that gives you a far better ability to identify them and to verify the veracity of the given identity than ever, right?
Yeah.
So, but I think the regulation needs to catch up with the tools, and it's understandable that they are taking their time, because there are, as I said, a lot of issues around, especially privacy and making sure that the customer remains sovereign over his or her data, that we shouldn't sort of just rush into doing these things. But my larger point in bringing up that example around identity is that we actually have a lot of tools at our disposal to be able to innovate on what I call the back office, or the support infrastructure and technology. That's another area that I think entrepreneurs can add a lot of value and can innovate and can create, not just in creating services for the customer directly.
Right. This podcast is brought to you by Venture by ALU, a free course for entrepreneurs. Do you want to know how to overcome entrepreneurial challenges from real-life experiences? Well, Venture is an online course designed for young and aspiring entrepreneurs. It features more than 10 ALU entrepreneur leaders who will guide and inspire young entrepreneurs. You can find Venture on venture.alueducation.com. Once again, venture.alueducation.com. Venture, a course for entrepreneurs by entrepreneurs. Now back to our conversation. Okay, so more or less just...
Does that make sense?
Yeah, so more or less just making it much easier to maneuver with your data, or the statistics or the analytics or the analysis that they have within their venture, per se. Am I getting that right?
Exactly. So that's an important part of it. But it's also to understand that it's not just about our usage of the data. A lot of this also feeds into the central bank and its need to to identify and understand who the customers are and what they're doing.
Right.
Because overall, their ultimate goal and responsibility is the stability of the financial system. So they need to be able to comfortably regulate all corners of the financial system, not just the banks. So whatever can be done to bring more efficiency or even more transparency to the things that they ask us to do to be able to give them comfort around the stability of the system. That's a very good thing.
Right. Right. Great. So, on to scalability on the continent. It's harder for a startup to scale on the African continent due to a fragmented financial infrastructure. So, what are some of the bottlenecks here that make this challenging? And if so, how are they getting solved by key financial institutions?
Well, that's a whole topic for for a podcast. So I won't presume to touch on all of them, but there are. Let's start. Since we started talking about regulation, so there are fragmentation around regulatory frameworks is an issue if you're trying to scale around the continent because central bank A is doing one thing, central bank B is doing something else. Clearly, that just there's a multiplication of the need to meet those requirements that takes a lot of resources, and frankly, the machine you need to meet those regulatory requirements is not always something that a startup will have the means to do, which is why I think perhaps for them it makes a lot of sense to partner with the likes of us, with the likes of the banks who are built from the ground up with that DNA around internal control, the DNA around regulatory sort of compliance, the DNA of compliance. So just going back to the beginning of my point, which is having so many different frameworks is an issue. So to the extent that there could be some form of harmonization across regions or across central banks, that would be a very big plus for a startup that's looking to scale. Because truth be told, I mean, there are a bunch of large markets like a Nigeria or a South Africa, an Ethiopia or Kenya. But the rest of the continent is sort of medium to small size markets. So in order to get to those countries, it would help if they had regulatory frameworks that are similar or frankly are the same. So I mean that's definitely a big issue in terms of being able to scale. I also think that being able to attract capital is also has been an issue over time. As much as every year you do see the reports and it shows that there is a great deal of growth in whether it's venture capital or just capital coming to our shores, but clearly, I think the need is greater still. And it's not also what is I think key is that it's not just capital on its own that I think makes a difference on the entrepreneurial journey. I think it's important that capital be intelligent about how it's deployed. So it be deployed towards solving real problems. As I was saying earlier, it can't just be a copycat. I always say you need fewer dog walking apps, more mosquito zapping apps. So let's how about we direct capital to things that are an actual issue for us on the continent. And for that, I mean, I do think that we need more of us, more Africans, especially more African women and more African professionals and entrepreneurs who are living on the continent. When I say living on the continent, that on the day-to-day basis, they can observe or simply even live through the challenges and see the opportunities, because I think that being on the ground gives you that appreciation that you can then bring to the tables where those decisions are being made around capital allocation. But that continuum isn't perfect yet. There's definitely a disconnect, I think, between the investment committees of the investment funds, or even the ones, the fund managers, who are still largely male. Um, and kind of obviously seeing the world through their eyes, and then the people on the ground who are living here, running businesses, raising children, across the various parts of the continent.
Yeah.
So I think that's what capital needs to be. It needs to be more abundant, clearly, but it also needs to be a lot more strategic, a lot more targeted. And obviously also, I think our to make it through the entrepreneurial journey on this continent, you do need support, you do need mentoring, you do need to be plugged into the networks that can help you through that journey, because it's definitely not an easy one, and it's not easy, not just because of the sort of infrastructure or the challenges of business, but I think just it can be a very lonely journey, trying to build something and trying to lead and trying to figure things out as you go, as much as you can be animated by an incredibly creative and an energetic spirit. I think what matters is to win the marathon. It's not a sprint, and it's not about how you do out the door or whether you raise the first round of money. It's, are you going to be around in 5 or 10 years? Will you have made an impact on people at large? But more importantly, and this may sound surprising, but more importantly, will you have made an impact on the people you directly work with?
Yeah.
And is that impact positive?
Yes. So we'll get into that topic of scalability later on in the future. Maybe we can have you on the podcast once again, so you can really talk about it in depth. But from hearing you speak, you talk a lot about women empowerment, women in entrepreneurial spaces, typically being women having to include themselves in spaces that they're not necessarily included in. So they'll have to fight for their chances and their opportunities. So maybe you can tell me more about your experiences as a woman in this space of the industry that you're in, and you know why you're so passionate about having women having the same opportunities that others would have.
It's in many ways it's basic math, and I think it make sense to exclude half the talent and half the energy and half the brains and half the however you want to look at it. And for me, I think there's a level of urgency that that COVID has brought in 2020. It's not that these issues weren't real or weren't being talked about or weren't being tackled prior to 2020. But personally, at least, as I'm kind of trying to live through this pandemic, while leading a team, raising children, and asking myself a lot of questions around what has this time come to teach us. What are we going to take out of this to make it something useful for the next decade? And essentially, one of the things I certainly have taken out of it so far is sort of the urgency in how we live our lives, and the urgency in going straight. It's not about rushing, but it's about going straight to what matters most, and asking yourself, how are you going to contribute to that, no matter how minute your contribution is. So, back to why women, it just makes, when there's urgency, we really need all hands on deck. So it's even more critical that we all participate, and we all bring our best selves. And there's really, I just don't think there's any time for fights around whose table is it, and do you have the right to sit here. I think as women, it's important that we feel welcome. We sit around the table, we build our own tables, however we want to see it. I think, first of all, mentally, we have to be very clear about the fact that we have the right to be in those spaces, and because we have something useful to share, we have a voice and it counts. We have a talent and it's useful, whatever that might be. Now, obviously, it's always a personal journey to finding that voice in oneself, and then to isolating the talent that we want to lead with, as multi-talented as we all are. And that work is very much, one that one has to do for oneself. And it's lifelong. It starts with the ability to be self-aware. It's about the ability to get to know oneself with every situation, to step back and ask yourself, what have I learned from this? What have I learned about myself from this? And how does this bring more to light my superpower? And then how does this bring more to light some of the development areas I have? And then how do I take all of that and go back into whatever room it is that I want to be a part of? So to me, it's not about inviting women in or making space for them. We're already here, and I also just think that we are, we're central to the future, not just from a just basic sort of biology perspective of birthing the children and taking the people forward as a people.
Right.
But beyond that, I think we're definitely, what we bring to the table is indispensable. So we there's no choice, especially in when there's fire on the mountain, like in 2020.
Right, I definitely see where you're coming from with that. So, if I'm understanding what you're saying, it's more of just the voice has been there, the space has been there, the conversations have been heard or had, and we're just more or less trying to highlight it or bring or amplify the voice of having women in these spaces, because it's not talked about enough. It's talked about, but it's not talked about enough.
Yeah, and beyond the voice is the action. That's what I was saying by there's fire on the mountain in 2020. So beyond talking, there's work to be done.
Right. And I recently had a read of your article on leading change in the time of adversity, and you've talked about how it's all about the team. Only a few decisions matter in the end. Um, your job is to decide, and lastly, leaders are both learners and teachers. And I'll shamelessly say that I was stalking your Twitter as well. And there's maybe a seminar or sort of like a keynote that you were part of that talked about good servant, poor master, and I feel like the article that you wrote about leading change in times of adversity really sort of has a correlation to that. If I'm mistaken, please correct me. So leaders are both learners and teachers as well. So how has continuous learning guided you in your career and led you to and leading your team as a trained coach?
Oh, it's central to central to who I am. I mean, way before my career, I was you could before what you could call a career. I mean, even as a child, I was a reader, and learning is definitely one of the central values that I grew up with in my family. Along with faith and pursuit of excellence, among other things. So I actually just fully, accept that. That I've got a bit of a nerd DNA. So now the thing that's interesting though, as one gets older, is to diversify your sources of learning and to understand even that there are multiple sources of learning. So clearly, as a child, yeah, I spent a lot of time reading and thinking that's where my learning was coming from. But frankly, you do get a lot of learning from experiential learning. It's from the proverbial, touch the stove once and then you learn something, from that. So as you bring that more to the present, yes, for me, continuing to learn from others, continuing to mine information, whether it's from the biographies of great leaders or from being able to really listen to what you're hearing from your team or what you're hearing from the customer, and really having the patience to dial down your own inner voice that wants to jump in with an answer or wants to jump in with ideas, and to just be able to sit back and take in and give space and create space for others to express themselves. I think that is definitely something that, for me at least, has been refined by my training as a coach. Because as a coach, the basic thing is you're not here to solve people's problems. You're not a therapist in the classic sense, in the psychology sense. You are here to listen, ask very good questions, which I think is also an incredibly underrated skill, and to create a framework where you can help somebody find their own answers, and then to hold them accountable to taking action. I mean, if I just summarize quickly what it means to be a coach, and to people who lead any kind of team, they will probably hear that as being key to running a team as well. So for me, I've found that to be incredibly useful in my day-to-day. And then when I say continuous learning, it's also continuously learning about your own self, and never feeling that you have arrived at any sort of port, when it comes to your own self development and to your own discovery of yourself. The voyage is just it truly is an odyssey. Even though I think the odyssey does end with Ulysses, getting back, but this one is hopefully sort of just ongoing. And I think it's in discovering your own layers. That's what wisdom comes from. Because by this point, I think you're quite comfortable with the fact that yes, you do have intelligence, but the point is, intelligence without values, without ethical fiber, without solid grounding, is plain dangerous, frankly, especially as you rise in power or you rise in opportunities to touch other people's lives. So really at this point, personally, I'm more after wisdom than just pure brain.
Right. And lastly, you are an executive, an entrepreneur, an investor, and most importantly, a woman that inspires a lot of people globally. So, as a final takeaway, if nobody's listening, but we want to get it from perspective, like your key takeaway from this, and what advice would you have for young women out there who want to aspire to be entrepreneurs or just want to lead self and lead others as well? So maybe you can give us maybe 2 or 3 advices for the young women out there.
Yeah, I actually love how you put it. Lead self and lead others, right? So in that order. So let's start with self. I think, touching back on the point I had earlier, your own self-development is really central. First and foremost. Yes. So it has to come first. So you have to be willing to invest in yourself and do whatever you can to get to know yourself better, to give yourself opportunities to grow, to take risks, to be afraid and still do it. What I've learned is that there's never going to be a time where you feel completely that you've got it, or you're confident that you're on top of this mountain, you know all this material, or you are great at this. And so don't wait for that to do. I think is to still be afraid, to still be doubtful, and to still have the voices telling you, well, I don't know if that article is original enough. Well, publish it. Put your best foot forward, and you will learn from that. You will, and be willing to learn from that, right? Because frankly, it's the ego that's trying to discourage you because it's so incredibly fragile and can't take any sort of criticism. But that's not you. That's not the real you and the central you. So that ego needs to be brought under control, which essentially is what you're saying, which is leading self. So I think for women, there's that first part. And then, the second part, I think, is really sort of facing a world that is constantly trying to either put you in your place or ask you to go back into your corner, tries to diminish you in whatever way, And for me, I would say one thing that, I think I was a slow learner. I only discovered, later in life. I wish I'd, my goal is to instill it in my daughter early on, is to understand that nothing, no one, attacks you, who didn't see your light in the first place. Because if you were a non-entity, if you weren't carrying anything good or positive, they wouldn't see you. They wouldn't notice you. They wouldn't find you to be worthy of their attack, whatever form it takes, right? So, so for me, it's like every time you then face that, you face people who are trying to extinguish your light or trying to convince you that it needs to be dimmed. Instead of internalizing that and then going into the journey of dimming your own light for their own purposes or to assuage their insecurities, is to take a second and say, if this is happening, then certainly there is a light here, and it's my job to make it brighter, not the opposite. Now, you may say, well, how do you know the difference between somebody trying to dim your light or somebody who's trying to give you, say constructive criticism as that can help you grow? And that's where I say go back to point number one, which is the knowing thyself, because the more you know you, the more you know what your strengths and weaknesses are, the more you face reality, and this is an important word about who you are, the more you're able to discern what constructive criticism versus an attempt at dimming your light. Now, I'll tell you, there's probably more attempts at dimming your light on average out there. So if you want to approach this purely statistically,
right.
But my point is, at the end of the day, lead self and make sure you bring your light to whatever room you're going into, so you are part of those bringing a solution, not those creating problems.
Great. Thank you so much for being with us, Rama. It's been amazing having you on here. You've given us so much insight, so much depth, and so much to think about in very bite-sized points as well. So, I really just want to appreciate you for that, and bringing your expertise as well in fintech and women empowerment. We can see your passion for Africa as well. So, yeah, thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you. This was fun. You had great questions, so you're a great hostess,
Thank you
Savannah.
so much.
So thank you so much.
Thank you so much for listening in on today's episode. Just as a reminder, you can find us on Spotify, Anchor, and Apple Music for a chance to subscribe and have exclusive access to all the gems of knowledge we drop here. This is the AOU podcast, Entrepreneur Leadership in Africa, real stories, real experiences. Thank you, Rama, for being with us today. Until the next time.